Hello, everybody. We're going to start now. We are so happy to see so many people here, particularly as it's beginning of spring. And we're so happy that you could join us for a continuation of our deep dive into the For the People Act. Of course, with Representative Sarbanes coming on as the primary sponsor and author of the bill, it's really important to hear from him what the next steps are. And we're thrilled to have Doug Gansler, former two-term Maryland Attorney General, who will also join us as a moderator, and we'll examine whether we can pass through the Senate and the potential impact on the voter suppression legislation currently being adopted in several states. I did want to initially welcome everybody to Big Tent. We are a group, for those of you who are new, that was formed in 2019. We are a national grassroots organization that breaks through the political noise to provide substantive information, concrete action items, and innovative activism opportunities to help members make a positive influence and difference in their communities. We have, our interest really is in education opportunities for women and men to become more civically engaged in our democracy. We recognize that all of our involvement is an essential factor in balancing the face of government, standing up for democracy and creating a driving force for positive change in America. And we hope to create an inclusive and broad coalition of men and women who are educated about the issues that are coming forth and are empowered to make a difference. Our values are mainstream American beliefs. So we believe in effective governance, decency, truthful and ethical leadership, and equality, justice, and opportunity for all people. And we do focus on pro-democracy reform issues, as well as basic civics issues from women's role in politics, equal rights, healthcare, environment, fiscal responsibility, and several other very important topics that we will address throughout the year. We look to educate, we look to engage, and we look to expand and broaden our outreach so we can amplify messages. Spotlight series is one of the ways that we do that, where we have speakers come and speak to us on a topic of great interest to Big Tent and to our members, and give access to our members to this opportunity through Zoom format at this point. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and Doug will go through the questions and make sure that there's answered as much as possible. So without further ado, I want to introduce Congressman John Sarbanes. He has represented Maryland's 3rd Congressional District in the United States Congress since 2007. And since 2017, he has chaired the Democracy Reform Task Force. It's a bold effort to build government that puts the public's interest ahead of special interests. He was born and raised in Baltimore. Congressman Sarbanes has experience working in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. He and his family live in Towson, giving him the opportunity to drive home every night and hear from the people he serves in Congress. Listening to their concerns allows him to better represent Maryland and has shaped his work in the House of Representatives. Doug Gansler is a former 2-term Attorney General of Maryland. He is also very good friends with Rich Powers and Emily, so we're grateful for the introduction to Doug from them. He was president of the National Association of Attorneys Generals, and as AG in Maryland, he focused on environmental, consumer, and public safety issues. He established the first statewide Internet Privacy and Safety Unit and implemented the first state AG's community-based prosecution program, which became a nationwide model for fair and effective crime fighting programs. He also established domestic abuse docket in Maryland and has distinguished himself by prosecuting polluters of the Chesapeake Bay. Currently, he is an attorney working in Washington, where he heads the state's attorney general's practice. So I want to hand it over to Congressman Sarbanes and Doug to start the conversation, and we look forward to an informative call. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Susan. Let me just add to your introduction of John Sarbanes, who I've known for almost 30 years. He's the very appropriate sponsor of HR 1 because his congressional district has been called, I think, a dead pterodactyl at some point. I mean, it's so sprawly, and he's in a bunch of different counties, which he can talk about. But also, and much more important, his father, Senator Sarbanes, and JP Sarbanes are cut from the same cloth. You often meet, and unfortunately, a lot of politicians who are, in my view, are in it for the wrong reasons. It's all about them and not serving the people. And John Sarbanes is the exact opposite of that. He is about the most ethical and well-respected person, certainly in Maryland politics. And he's been fighting this fight for many years, which, as we talked about last night, when we sort of did a little preview, he felt like he was standing alone in the desert, and now he's got some friends. So what I thought we'd do is go ahead and start with JP to make some opening remarks for about 10 minutes or so on his voyage with this bill and how it got to where it is and where he thinks it's going. And then we can, I'll ask some questions, but I think we're both far more interested in your questions. So go ahead and put them in the chat room, and I will synthesize and sort of collectively put them together and ask the Congressman those questions as after he finishes his remarks.
So thanks very much, Doug and Susan and everybody who's on the call. Appreciate the opportunity to be with Big Tent tonight and share my thoughts on HR 1, which is also now S1 on the Senate side, as you may know. So the For the People Act has a priority billing on both sides of the Capitol, which is terrific. Footnote here, in the last 20 years, any legislation that has gotten HR 1, S1 designation has become law. So that is a good omen. We're excited about that. I want to thank Doug Gansler for his service to the state of Maryland and to our country over many, many years, and his friendship. Speaking of attorney generals, I would say that, or attorneys general, I guess is the way we do it. The current Attorney General of Maryland, Brian Frosh, led an effort to get 20 attorneys general from across the country to sign a letter endorsing HR 1 in the last 6 weeks or so, which has been a very powerful endorsement, along with many other supports, which I'll refer to as we move forward. So here we are. This is a moment of great opportunity for the country and for our democracy. We saw in November the American people basically reach out and pull the democracy back from the brink. That was an incredible moment. But then we saw on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol that what they pulled back is still extremely fragile, and it needs a lot of care and attention and strengthening. And we think that this bill, the For the People Act, meets the moment. If there was any doubt about why it's so important, that has been laid to rest by the activity we've seen over the last 6 or 8 weeks across the country at the state level, where Republican state lawmakers have introduced over 250 bills in 43 states to roll back access to the ballot box. And so initially there was a kind of panic about that, but we were able to say, well, we've been working on something for the last 5 years that can meet that challenge and overcome it. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we move ahead. Let me give you a couple of frames through which you can look at the For the People Act. Attorney General Eric Holder testifying last week in front of the Senate Rules Committee, which is chaired by Amy Klobuchar, and it's where the S1 bill is getting its review. He said that the For the People Act, when you connect it to the reforms that are contained as well in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, they represent the most consequential civil rights and voting rights legislation that we've seen in a generation. Another frame is that when you take the ethics and campaign finance reform provisions that are contained in HR 1, it represents the most significant anti-corruption package probably that has ever passed any House of Congress, in passing in the House a few weeks ago, or been reviewed in the United States Senate. So the package as a whole will advance voting rights and also push back on corruption in our politics, which has led to the deep cynicism in the country. We know, for example, that Donald Trump himself traded on that sentiment. He exploited it. He took it to the dark side under his mantra of drain the swamp, he came to Washington, he broke a lot of furniture, and he descended into an ethical morass instead of actually cleaning the place up. But he understood that the sentiment in the country was broad and deep, this anger at politics as usual, at the undue influence that special interests were having in Washington, and he capitalized on that. The good news is that in 2018, a team of reformers came from around the country, took back the House of Representatives, found many of the same audience that Trump had turned to and had exploited, and said to them, instead of going to Washington and burning the place to the ground, we'll go there and try to clean it up, fix it, and make your voice count again. And that was very resonant. It led to Democrats taking back the House in 2018. So we arrive at this moment with a public that wants to see change. They've been sending us a memo for years in the form of wave elections, basically expressing their displeasure and anger and frustration at Washington. And it looks like we're finally reading that memo. Here's what the grievances have been, and here's what HR 1 does to try to address them. The first thing we heard from people is, in America, in the year 2020, we ought to be able to get to the ballot box every 2 years without having to run an obstacle course. And that's right. And that's why if you look at the reforms in the bill, things like automatic same-day and online voter registration, no excuse absentee ballot voting, a minimum of 15 days of consecutive early voting across the country, severe penalties for voter suppression, voter purging, voter intimidation. That represents a vision of voting in America that's the gold standard. And we ought to meet that gold standard instead of lagging behind peer nations around the world. They said to us, we're tired of politicians choosing their voters instead of the other way around. Let's fix partisan gerrymandering in America. And we include a fix for that with the requirement of independent redistricting commissions in every state in the country. They asked us, when you go to Washington, can you please behave ethically, with accountability, be transparent, represent the public interest, not your own self-interest? And so we have embedded in HR 1 a significant number of ethics reforms, conflict of interest rules, and other things that can restore people's confidence in how we conduct ourselves. They wanted us to protect American elections and our infrastructure against foreign interference and attacks on our infrastructure. So we've got provisions that do that. And they also said to us, please, when you get to Washington, remember who sent you. Don't get too tangled up in the special interests and the PACs and the super PACs. Remember who sent you there and continue to represent our interests. So we have significant reforms in the money and politics space as well. Taken together, this represents the most transformational package of democracy reforms perhaps ever brought in any chamber of Congress. Getting it over the finish line is not going to be easy. We've done it in the House twice, but we understand that the path in the Senate is a difficult one given the filibuster and the procedural rules. I, however, am quite confident that this is going to happen because I think the public is demanding it in a way that we cannot not do this. Let's put it that way. If you look at how the Senate is in Democratic hands, you understand that there's almost a kind of cosmic force at work right now. The state that through 2 runoff elections on the same day delivered the US Senate to the Democrats was the state of Georgia, represented in the United States Congress by John Lewis for decades. John Lewis wrote the first 300 pages of HR 1 S1, which are all of the voting reforms that I just spoke about. So in order to cement his legacy and make sure that it's redeemed properly, we've got to get this bill through. And I believe at the end of the day, we're going to make it happen because the opportunity cost is too high. Let me close with a couple of observations, and I'd love to take some questions from you. Many of the provisions in this bill have bipartisan origins. FEC reform, reforming the Office of Government Ethics, protecting election infrastructure, pushing back against the money influence. Some of the key voting and registration reforms have bipartisan origins, either among members of Congress or bipartisan commissions that have been convened over the last 20 years. HR 1 polls with solid majorities among Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So notwithstanding the fact that Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy and the leadership of the Republican Party in Congress has stood against this bill from day one, calling it a Democratic power grab and so forth, it actually represents what most Americans want to see when it comes to cleaning up our government and restoring their voice. And we're leaning on that very hard because we know out in the country that strong support exists. Finally, as was alluded to on the front end here, if we can fix our democracy so it actually translates the will of the people, all the other things we want to see get done can start happening. We can get good gun safety legislation. We can have a fair tax code. We can combat climate change. We can do all these things that have been blocked by a system that's become rigged over the last few years and has led to that cynicism in the country. So this is the gateway issue. This sets the table for all the things that we want to see, but we got to get over the finish line, and having your interest and support for that broad campaign for the people can be the difference maker. So I thank you for the opportunity to be with you this evening. I look forward to answering any questions or hearing any suggestions that you might have on how we can proceed forward.
Okay, thank you, JP. Let me start with sort of a fundamental question that's already been raised in the chat room. And as the former Attorney General believing in states' rights, I have a particular interest in your view on this, which is how do you get around this idea that states control their own elections and the enforcer being the state Attorney General or the Board of Elections, and the federal government imposing its will on the states? And talk about the juxtaposition of interplay there.
Yeah, states do control their own elections, but they don't control federal elections. The authority to control federal elections resides with Congress, according to and anchored in the time, place, and manner clause of the United States Constitution. That gives us the right opportunity and authority as Congress to set baseline standards and norms for how federal elections are conducted across the country. Now, as a practical matter, any state that's going to have to abide by those norms when it comes to conducting the federal elections in that state is also going to apply those norms to state elections and local elections, because as a matter of efficiency and logistics, it's not going to make any sense to have two completely separate systems for voting and registration in those states. So we can leverage the authority that we have over federal elections to make sure that these baseline standards on registration, voting, early voting, absentee ballot voting, and so forth are in place in every state across the country. And I think the Brennan Center has estimated, and they've been the group that's documented these voter suppression efforts at the state level. They estimate that 90% of the laws that are being pursued right now at the state level that fall into this voter suppression category can be stopped in their tracks if we can get HR 1 S1 passed. That's why it's such a critical priority right now.
And just following up on that, and this is a question from Sherry Warnicki and Mike Pfeiffer and others. If it does look doomed because it's a 791-page bill with that sort of tries to fix everything at once, including gerrymandering and campaign finance reform and others, is there a thought or is there a recognition or willingness to attempt a standalone election bill and election security, mail-in ballots, and that kind of thing for sort of a compromise?
Yeah. I'm not conceding yet any part of this package or the notion that it should be split apart. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is in navigating this through the House of Representatives over the last two Congresses, I've come to understand that the power and success of this bill comes from keeping all parts of it together. That's because it meets equities and concerns across our caucus in a very important way. And if you start pulling pieces of this out and running separate plays, not only do you endanger those pieces like, like an antelope getting separated from the herd, but you also actually endanger the viability of what's left behind. Secondly, when it comes to voting rights in particular, that's certainly an issue that animates the Democratic base, but it also animates the Republican base. And it's easily supercharged in the wake of the Stop the Steal narrative and the other sort of fraud narrative that has been perpetuated by Trump and his acolytes over the last few months. So it gets you into a space of real partisanship and sort of contest. Whereas if you have the other parts of the bill included, the ones that push back on corruption, that has a broad appeal across the political spectrum. And in fact, there's a Jane Mayer article that I recommend to you in the New Yorker from a few days ago, where she picked up on some political operatives in the Republican Party talking about H.R. 1 and expressing their anxiety that Democrats would begin lifting up these anti-corruption parts because they don't really have a defense for that, even among their own audience. So the power of the bill comes from keeping it together as long as we possibly can. And every day in the House, we saw the benefits of that. Last thing, Doug, the people have told us to do it this way. The people have said to us, if you make it so we can vote, but the people we send to Washington get captured by the big money and the special interests, you haven't solved our problem. If they go to Washington and they don't act ethically because there aren't rules in place and ethical codes to govern behavior, you haven't solved our problem. In other words, to restore the voice of everyday Americans and make them feel again like they count and address head on the cynicism that they feel, you've got to show them you're doing everything you possibly can to make this work. And that's why voting, ethics, campaign finance need to be in this bill. There's nothing hugely controversial here. Only controversy is why it's taken us this long to respond to that memo that's been sent to us every 2 years for like the last 20 years to make the change that the public wants to see.
Talking about sort of politics, Laura Mosdale and Mary Clens are interested in your view on whether you have to nix the filibuster and reform the filibuster rules in order to have a better chance of getting this passed.
Yes.
Great.
That's the simple answer. The longer answer is we're going to try, I think, on the Senate side. I think Amy Klobuchar and Leader Schumer and Jeff Merkley, who's the sponsor of the bill on the Senate side, they're going to, give the Republicans a chance to do the right thing here. But the idea that Mitch McConnell would supply 10 Republicans to support a bill that he knows is going to dismantle this minoritarian power structure that he's built over the last few years. And let's emphasize here, McConnell has used voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, and big money to spread disinformation in a way that has allowed his party to not be accountable to a broad and diverse electorate out there. If you can create an ecosystem that manipulates the political town square in terms of its size and makeup, then you don't have to be accountable to a diverse electorate, which, by the way, means that extreme elements inside your own party get traction, more traction than they deserve, which we're definitely seeing with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and otherwise. If you create a new system, a new democracy where that accountability to a diverse electorate is critical, then the Republican Party is going to have to clean up its act. This will actually be better for the Republicans and a strong two-party system going forward if we can get these reforms, because they will have to be more accountable. But for the moment, they're leaning back into their playbook from the last few years. So McConnell's not going to give us 10. He's probably not even going to give us 1 or 2. So we got to do something about the 60 vote threshold. I'm not an expert on the Senate rules, and I don't want to be an expert on the Senate rules, but there's a lot of different ways you can skin a cat. And Jeff Merkley and others are looking at different ways of doing that. Do you require, as Joe Biden suggested the other day in what was a news breaking comment, require the Senate to go back to the standing filibuster where you actually have to get up and talk if you want to delay legislation and a vote? Do we explore the idea of a democracy exemption from the filibuster? I kind of like that because I feel like it's crazy to hold legislation hostage to a supermajority requirement that is legislation trying to restore majority rule in the country. That ought to be subject to a simple up or down majority vote. So that's gaining some traction. One way or the other, we got to get it done. And I think the Senate will figure out how to do it. If Mitch McConnell's not going to cooperate, we got to get it done. And by the way, if the shoe was on the other foot, the Republicans would be at a signing ceremony in the White House by now. So we've got to use the power the public has given us to fix this democracy, not for the benefit of Democrats. Let me emphasize this. But in a sort of patriotic exercise of lifting up all people in this country and giving them faith again in how this democracy operates. That's what's pushing us forward. That's what's been motivating me from day one.
Imagine hypocrisy on Capitol Hill. Jill Zipperin and Andy Lasoria are interested in your sort of political strategy on how you're going to get this done. What's the messaging? When do you think the Senate's going to act? And what is your plan to get this done?
So here's how I think it's going to go. I think relatively soon you will see the package come to the floor under the current rules. It will fail because of the filibuster. And then I think the Senate caucus, the Democratic caucus, will step back and have a conversation with itself about how to proceed, understanding that this can't fail. So they'll look at various options for adjusting the filibuster. You have some in that caucus that want to jettison the filibuster completely. They view it, in the words of Barack Obama, as a Jim Crow relic that has served no really useful purpose for a long time, but has been abused. So that's one view in the caucus. Others want to hold on to it because of a sense of the tradition of the Senate and the notion that it somehow helps to encourage bipartisan compromise. We're not seeing any evidence of that right now, so I don't know how far that argument goes. And then there's various sort of iterations in between. From a timing standpoint, it's very important, though, that we get this done in the next 2 to 3 months. For starters, anything you let lag for too long starts to lose its momentum. We put some good momentum behind this bill by getting it passed in the House a couple of weeks ago, our second passage of that bill in the last 2 Congresses. So there is momentum. It's getting a lot of attention because of this state power grab that we see from the Republicans and the anxiety that's produced across the country. So it's getting lifted up. There's organic uptake around the bill. But the reason to get it done sooner rather than later is the experts like the Brennan Center are telling us that many of the reforms that it contains are ones that we could actually have in place by the 2022 midterm election, but not if we wait too long. And that includes voting reforms, strengthening the Federal Election Commission so it can be the cop on the beat and blow the whistle on the big money actors that are sort of crossing boundaries in the last 2-3 months of every election cycle. It means on the front end of the 10-year redistricting period, getting a new process for drawing district lines across the country. And thank you, Doug, for mentioning my district, which has been called a broken-winged pterodactyl lying prostrate across central Maryland. That's the phrase you're looking for.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that happens. If we can get that in place in time for 2022, it means we've gotten in place for the whole 10-year period for which those districts will be in force. So there's a lot at stake here that is pushing us to get this done sooner rather than later. To the extent there's any changes, and there will be some modest, I hope, on the Senate side, it will have to come back to the House. So we're going to have to get passage again in the House. So procedurally, process-wise, you don't want to have too many twists and turns in this thing, or it'll end up getting delayed substantially. Then the power of it can't be deployed in ways that we'd like to see for the 2022 midterm.
Kitty Douglas, Gail Shields Miller, and Rich Powers himself are concerned about potential court challenges, both with the conservative Supreme Court, and how would, if this were to go to the Supreme Court and they got it right, how would that affect state court decisions such as the Georgia Supreme Court and other states that have had interesting rulings?
Well, again, the rulings that would be coming from the Supreme Court would be with respect to our exercising our authority over federal elections. So those decisions, whichever way they go, would control the norms and standards that we're setting for federal elections, which would have that leveraging effect on state and local elections as well. In terms of the constitutionality generally, we've been very careful in both rounds of this, putting it together, to make sure that we were anchoring these provisions in the clear sort of constitutional jurisprudence of the court so it could withstand challenges. And we actually went back in this time and further refined what they call findings language, other statements of purpose, legislative purpose, and intent within the bill. If you go through there, you will find a series of statements which indicate our understanding of what the constitutional basis is for whatever the provisions may be. And we think we're on very, very solid ground with respect to all of these reforms. Now, that doesn't mean they won't be challenged. Of course, they'll be challenged 5 minutes after this bill passes, everywhere, in every possible way. But we think that those challenges can be met and overcome, and that this bill will meet the constitutional standard and be upheld ultimately.
Ida Schmertz and Dominique Browning were interested in the letter that I'm not familiar with, written by 70 or so African-American businessmen, including Ken Chenault, and wondering if sort of the business community getting behind it might be helpful in this passage, because that's where money goes to some of the people that may be against it.
Absolutely. And let me mention, there is a coalition called the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition, which now has over 200 organizational members across the country. This includes business groups, as well as labor groups, good government groups, environmental groups, faith groups, consumer protection. Why? Because all of these different constituencies have recognized that until we fix the basic rules of the democracy and the public policy making apparatus in Washington, so that it actually translates the will of the people, all these other things that we want to see happen can't happen. And I think there is definitely within the business community an enlightened perspective here that you've got to make the democracy function. I was in front, I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago, in front of a bunch of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And there was an understanding in that room that if the people of this country start to believe that our economic system of capitalism is beginning to hijack our political system with undue influence, then they'll start turning against the economic system. So it's actually in the interest of our capitalist system here to make sure that we in a sense, separate political voice from economic voice, and that people have confidence that the decisions being made in their politics and by their elected representatives are ones that are balanced and represent a cross-section of interests and inputs, and it's not being rigged by the economic system, or else they'll turn against it. So getting back to this notion that this is a patriotic exercise, not one that's designed to nod in the direction of any one political party or any one constituency or advocacy group. This is about making our democracy work in basic fundamental ways. I will commend to you an article in The Guardian from about a week ago. We can get this to people. Freedom House, which does a scorecard every year of countries around the world in terms of the strength of their democracies, in 1 year has knocked the United States down 11 points, from 94 out of 100 to 83 out of 100, which has put us on a par with countries around the world you wouldn't imagine that we'd be aligned with in terms of that scorecard. And they said the three major reasons for it were difficulty accessing the franchise in America, in other words, our voting standards, partisan gerrymandering, and the influence of big money on our politics. Those three things, all of which are addressed in H.R. 1, are contributing to the decline and fall of American democracy at a time, by the way, when President Biden, I think rightly, wants to go around and strengthen democracy abroad. Well, to have the credibility to do that as Democrats, independents, and Republican patriots, we've got to have a democracy that we feel good about, that we're proud of. And by the way, the better we feel about our own democracy, the less cynical we become, the less vulnerable and exposed we are to foreign actors who want to get in here and sow discord. Do you know how much easier it is for China or Russia to get on these digital ad platforms and cause mischief and sow discord and spread disinformation if they arrive on the scene with us already doubting our own democracy? If we strengthen it and we make it better, it's going to make it more resilient to all of those attacks from outside. So there's many, many dividends that this can pay.
I guess a question dear to my heart came from Susan Lehman, which is, and first of all, Susan, thank you for sending the Guardian article around and the New Yorker article around. You're just bragging about your technological talents. But there's a recognition of the power of the state attorneys general, both as the chief law enforcement officers of their states, the chief legal officers of their states, and as the regulators of law of election law in their states. What can the folks, we have a pretty vast crowd on the call from a number of states, including states with Republican attorneys general. And sadly, of the 50 plus one, including DC, there's 26 Republican AGs today and 25 Democrats. So there's a lot of states which are sort of not in line with your bill. What can the folks on the call do regarding their own state enforcement of election rights?
Well, I would certainly, to the extent you can connect with the attorney generals and to secretaries of state, I would say those are the two principal officials in each state that have the most jurisdiction, let's say, or connection to voting and how elections are conducted. So I would first survey to see where those officials are in this discussion. There's actually Republican secretaries of state who are quite supportive, not all of them, but some that are quite supportive of the voting reforms. They've seen in certain states, for example, that no excuse absentee ballot voting works just fine, and it's been in a practice for many, many years, et cetera. So I would first sort of survey where your attorney general and your secretary of state is on this, and then join what I know are, in a sense, petitions and advocacy that's being directed to them, as well as to the the senators in those states and to House delegation members, because even if your House member supported this bill when it came before us a few weeks ago, keeping them strong is going to be critical as we move forward, because we're climbing Mount Everest here, and the higher we go, the more the gale force winds are blowing and the thinner the oxygen gets. But we can see the summit up there. So every kind of advocacy that you can bring to bear, I think can make a difference. And just on that front, I would say that there's a very sophisticated campaign that's been put together by Eric Holder's group, which is the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and an organization called End Citizens United. They've teamed up to launch, I think at last count was a $30 million, what they call Campaign for the People, which is to push this reform forward. So we can certainly connect you to the leadership in that coalition that is putting together a grassroots, grass tops, and sophisticated branding campaign nationally, as well as on a state-by-state basis, depending on who needs to hear what from whom to make sure that we get this done. We've also been gratified that Michelle Obama and her group, When We All Vote, sent a letter recently to the American people, along with 60 well-known celebrities, saying, get behind the For the People Act, not to be outdone by his wife. Barack Obama, not too long ago, tweeted out his support of the bill. And we've seen strong statements coming from the White House and President Biden as well. So I think there's a recognition that we need to get this done. But those who don't want to see it happen are going to throw everything they can at it. So it's going to be a tough fight, and we're going to need as many allies in this battle as we can possibly muster.
You mentioned both redistricting and the role of money, Citizens United and so forth. So Susan Lehman and Susan Benham both were interested in those issues and how obviously they're in your bill. What are the chances of getting those two issues? I mean, Citizens United, some I think President Biden amongst them has called the worst decision in the Supreme Court, and the one he'd want to get overturned, which is understandable. And what is the likelihood of actually seeing some reform vis-a-vis Citizens United and redistricting going forward?
Well, redistricting is pretty clear cut. I mean, if we can get these nonpartisan independent redistricting commissions in place across the country, which is the essence of what we've included in the For the People Act, that will just create a much more fair and representative way of drawing districts and bringing people into the United States House of Representatives. The Citizens United case is tricky because that's a court decision, obviously, more than 10 years old, which basically gave equal status to political speech along with other speech, and in a sense said that corporations should be treated like people. So they took two bad ideas, they put them together, and they created the Citizens United decision. In order to overcome that, you either need a dramatic change in the makeup of the court, and of course at this point in time we're going in the wrong direction on that, not the right direction, or you need a constitutional amendment that would allow Congress to regulate political speech in ways that could address this really undue influence that the super PACs and the secret money are having on our politics. Now, we can do some things, and we do them in this bill in terms of disclosure and transparency, so we know where that secret money comes from. But we can't do a whole lot else in terms of controlling it. That has to come through a constitutional amendment, and that's a long and difficult process. As you know, you need 2/3 of the House and the Senate. You need 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it. Even if everything was going well, that would take a long time. So what we did put in the bill is a statement of purpose and findings that say, we believe as a Congress that the Citizens United case needs to be overturned, that Congress should have the ability to regulate money in politics in a robust way. And so we make that statement. To actually get that done, absent the court changing up its position on this, we've got to go get that constitutional amendment. I support that, but that's a process that will take a while. In the meantime, we can put all these reforms in that can help diminish the influence of big money, including, by the way, setting up a small donor matching system to fund congressional campaigns, which not only empowers smaller donors because they feel like they have more ownership of the process and they feel like they're more respected if candidates turn in their direction. But evidence across the country from where these systems have been implemented, including New York City and other public financing models like Connecticut and other states have, so many of you may be familiar with this. The evidence is that these kinds of systems allow a more diverse set of candidates to run and compete and win. There's more gender diversity, there's more racial diversity, there's more socioeconomic diversity among the candidates who can stand for office and be viable because they can access resources in a different kind of way and they aren't kind of pushed to the margins by the way the current system operates. So there's a lot of things we can do to push back on that undue influence that we see in the money space, even as we're pursuing the constitutional amendment path to deal with the Citizens United case.
And on the Citizens United, Susan Bevan would like you to address sort of the Republican argument that unions are a part of the problem in terms of their capability of giving large sums of money and resting on Citizens United.
Well, I mean, unions and corporations are treated the same way in our bill in terms of disclosure and transparency. So we understand that, you know, you don't want any particular specific interest group to be in a position of being able to lean on how our politics operate or how policy gets made in Washington in an undue way. And that should apply across the board. And I think we've brought an agnostic lens to the reforms that we've deployed with respect to the kind of money part of the HR1 S1 package. We know that the average person out there is just tired of feeling like somebody else is calling the shots and it's kind of an insider game, whatever your perspective might be, coming from the conservative side of the spectrum or coming from the liberal side of the spectrum. You just want to feel like your individual voice actually has power and matters in the system. That's been our North Star from the beginning. Every time we had to make a decision about what's in and what's out with respect to the bill, we asked ourselves the question, will this provision make ordinary citizens out there feel more connected to their democracy and feel like their voice actually matters? And if the answer to that was yes, it stayed in the bill. If the answer was no, this is just being put in there to meet some particular constituency's interests, then it wasn't going to survive the test. That has really guided us through this process. And yes, it resulted in about 750 pages, but that's because there's a lot of things that are broken right now with the democracy. And we've been hearing about it for years from our constituents and people across the country. Now is our time to fix it.
So Sarah Umberger, who lives in West Virginia, would like to know what can be done regarding Senator Manchin, who through happenstance and circumstances has become one of the most powerful people, along with Mitch McConnell, I suppose, in America right now on your bill and others. And there's a lot of, actually 3 or 4 questions address Senator Manchin. So how do you go about dealing with that? And I guess Kirsten Sinema to some extent as well.
Well, I think for starters, you have to respect where Manchin's coming from. And I think he's coming from a place of wanting to look out for the people he represents in West Virginia. So I think the more we are able to connect him to the parts of this bill that empower the people he cares about, the more supportive he's going to be. And, you know, that's a state where Donald Trump got almost 70% of the vote. And part of Trump's message was this thing about Washington doesn't care about you. It's disrespecting your voice. You know, the big money crowd is calling the shots and rolling over you every day. And he went and he exploited that anger and sentiment out there, as he did in many places in this country. To the extent this bill is trying to respond to that sort of imbalance in where power should reside in this country, and is trying to lift up the voices of everyday people in West Virginia who feel disrespected, I think that's something Manchin can grab onto and feel good about. So we're being respectful of every member of the Senate, every member of the House for that matter. We have to make the case, I think we've been doing it pretty effectively to this point, that what's in this bill meets the expectations of the people that you represent and that you care about. And I think the more that members kind of absorb that, the stronger they're going to feel, at least on the Democratic side. I mean, to be honest, Republicans should understand this as well. They could be leading on so many parts of this bill, but they've chosen not to. But at least for the Democrats, that in the near term, I think we're going to need to get this done, showing them that this bill meets their values and stands up for the people they represent, I think is the most powerful way to make the case. And that's how we're going to do it. And I think we can be successful with that.
In second to last question, which is this: if you had your crystal ball, taking yourself away from your bill for 1 minute, obviously you're becoming a champion of Voting Rights Act and voting rights for people and against voter suppression. But going forward, how do you see mail-in voting sort of evolving? And then are we going to get to a place somewhere where you go to the airport, like, and there's the clear thing where someone's going to look in your eye or your fingerprint, and that's going to be your identification? All this other stuff will go away. And when will that happen?
Well, I don't think we ever want to get there. And one of the things that we've got in our bill is to require paper ballots so that there is a traceable record. Because however much humans get tantalized by the next generation of technological gimmickry, there's also a part of us that wants to hold something in our hand, particularly if that's the thing that reflects and represents our voice in our own democracy. And so while we want to make these various options of how to vote easier for people, so we can maximize the opportunity for people to exercise their franchise, I think we have to hold on to some tangible things that reflect the vote that we cast and are, lend themselves to audit and recounts and other things when you get into tight elections and so forth. But look, I think the pandemic pushed us to a new place when it comes to mail-in voting. There's no question. Many people saw how convenient that was. I was amazed at how many people were contacting me as they were following their ballot online. Like, I sent it in, it was received, it's now been counted, it's now been tallied. I mean, the citizen ownership of what it means to be a voter in this country reached new heights in this last election. That was a beautiful thing to see. That's kind of another reason we have to deliver on this reform, because if the people of this country still care enough to reach out and rescue our democracy as they did in November, then we as their representatives should care enough to go fix it so it doesn't have to be a fight every 2 years to get to the ballot box. So I think what you'll have in the future is people have many different ways to vote. But the important thing is this: when you get up on the day that you've decided you're going to go vote, whether it's sitting at your dinner table, your dining room table, and filling in an oval, or whether it's going to an early voting site, or whether it's voting in person on election day, You should be able to do that without having to worry about making like 5 contingency plans for something that's going to go wrong. We should have confidence that we can wake up in the morning on that day and cast our vote. And can you imagine if we built a system where that confidence was the baseline? Then all this time and energy we've been spending every 2 years trying to compensate for something that's broken could actually go towards encouraging more civic engagement and lifting up more voters and finding ways for people to bring their voice into the political town square. That's the promise of this. It's long overdue for us to catch up with our peer nations, for us to be the gold standard. It's crazy that more than 50 years after John Lewis shed blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, marching for voting rights in this country, that we still can't get it right. This is our opportunity to do that, and that's why we're going to push it as hard as we possibly can.
So Mary Himes was instrumental in getting you on this call. I believe you know her husband.
Yeah.
But everybody, I think I speak for everybody on the call, is energized and excited about what you've been able to do, and you've sort of carried the ball this far. What can the folks on the call do? How can we, as we wrap up here, what can people on the call do to help you get your narrative out, the message out, and the importance of this bill across the country? And you have people who have influence on the call and are from many, many states around the country.
Yeah. So I would say the first thing is education. Let people know there is a solution for this, because, you know, a lot of the cynicism comes from people just not believing we can ever fix this stuff. And in this moment, to let people know there is a piece of legislation that can actually fix a lot of what ails our democracy. That's number one. Put it in front of them. There's a lot of different ways this bill has been captured and digested, and we can certainly get you that information. But frankly, you can Google HR 1 for the People Act, and you will find your way to a lot of really good information. Secondly, in terms of activating volunteers and activists and people who just want to kind of raise their voice and be part of the chorus demanding this change, I would recommend, and we can get you these links as well, that you go to the Declaration for American Democracy. I would also recommend Common Cause, which is deploying a lot of the grassroots energy behind this bill across the country. And then End Citizens United, Let America Vote, which is an organization that has teamed up with the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, also has a kind of volunteer portal. But they're also continuing to marshal resources to put behind this very broad national and then state targeted campaign to give that positive brand, educate people through, you know, television commercials and online digital commercials and so forth, as well as building a grassroots and grass tops kind of connective tissue behind this effort. So I highly recommend ECU, LAV, and the NDRC Redistricting Committee, a coalition, as a place. And if you're interested in that, we can definitely hand any of you who want to learn more about that campaign, how it's being organized, how it's being resourced, over to the folks that are leading it. And they can get much more specific than I can about what that opportunity is. So we can certainly hand that off.
So I think everybody learned tonight, and appreciate everybody's time and attention, that not only does Maryland have the coolest flag in the United States, but we have one of the greatest congressmen in the United States. Thank you, JP Sarbanes, for joining us. I'll throw it over to Emily Powers from the great state of Mississippi, a proud graduate of Millsaps College.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, both Doug for moderating and Congressman Sarbanes for giving us so much of your time. This is a subject that we've all been very interested in, and I just can't tell you, I hope you'll look in the chat, but people have really appreciated your depth of knowledge, your commitment, your obvious commitment to our democracy. So on behalf of Big Tent, thank you so much. And we will be following up with all of your suggestions, which are fantastic.